week for language arts. Today, go ahead and get out your language arts notebooks, turn to a clean sheet, name today's date. Go ahead and read our objective today. I can explain the significance of specific lines and events in Animal Farm and what they reveal about characters and the plot. This is the similar lesson and objective we talked about in our previous lesson. Today, we're going to be finishing up the tale of Animal Farm. Your objective today is to read Chapter 10 and answer the following questions. Number 1, what is the significance about the following line? Squealer was so fat that he could with difficulty see out of his eyes. Number 2, what is significant about the line? It was a pig walking on his hind legs. And number 3, what is significant of Napoleon carrying a whip in his trotter? Join me now as we'll be reading the final chapter in Animal Farm. Chapter 10. Years passed. The seasons came and went, and these short animal lives fled by. A time came when there was no one who remembered the old days before the rebellion, except Clover, Benjamin and Moses the raven, and a number of pigs. Muriel was dead, Bluebell, Jessie, and Pincher were dead. Jones, too, was dead. He had died from an inebriated home in another part of the country. Snowball was forgotten. Boxer was forgotten, except for a few who had known him. Clover was an old, stout mare now, stiff in the joints and with a tendency of brewery eyes. She was 2 years past the retiring age, but in fact no animal had actually ever retired. The talk of setting aside a corner of the pasture for superannuated animals had long since been dropped. Napoleon was now a mature boar of 24 stone. Squealer was so fat that he could with difficulty see out of his eyes. Only old Benjamin was much the same as ever, except for being a little gray around the muzzle, and since Boxer's death, more morose and taciturn than ever. There were many more creatures in the farm now, though the increase was not so great as had been expected in earlier years. Many animals had been born to whom the rebellion was only a dim tradition, passed on by word of mouth, and others who had been brought, who had never heard mention of such a thing before their arrival. The farm possessed 3 horses now besides Clover. They were fine, upstanding beasts, willing to work and good comrades, but very stupid. None of them proved able to learn the alphabet beyond the letter B. They accepted everything they were told about the rebellion and the principles of animalism, especially from Clover, for whom they had utmost filial respect, but it was doubtful whether they understood much of it. The farm was more prosperous now and better organized. It had even been enlarged by 2 fields which had been bought from Mr. Plinkington. The windmill had been successfully completed at last, and the farm possessed a threshing machine and a haying elevator of its own, and various new buildings had been added to it. Whymper had brought himself a dog cart. The windmill, however, had not been used for generating electrical power. It was used for milling corn and brought in a handsome money profit. The animals were hard at work building yet another windmill. When that one was finished, so it was said, the dynamos would be installed. The luxuries of which Snowball had once taught the animals to dream, the stalls were electric light and hot and cold water and 3 days a week, were no longer talked about. Napoleon had denounced such ideas as contrary to the spirit of animalism. The true happiness, he said, lay in working hard and living frugally. Somehow, it had seemed as though the farm had grown richer without making the animals themselves any richer, except, of course, for the pigs and the dogs. Perhaps this was partly because there were so many pigs and so many dogs. It was not that creatures did not work after their fashion. There was, as Squealer was never tried of explaining endless work, in the supervision and organization of the farm. Much of this was work of a kind that the other animals were too ignorant to understand. For example, Squealer told them that the pigs had to expand enormous labors every day upon a mysterious thing called files, reports, minutes, and memorialed. There were large sheets of paper that had been closely converted with writing, and as soon as they were covered, they were burnt in the furnace. This was the highest importance in the welfare of the farm, Squealer said, but still neither pig nor dog produced any food by their own labor. And there were many of them, and their appetites were always good. As for the others, their life, so far as they knew, has always been. They were generally hungry, they slept on straw, and they drank from the pool, their labors in the fields, the winters they were troubled by the cold, and in the summer by the flies. Sometimes the older ones among them racked their dim memories and tried to determine whether the early days of the rebellion, when Joan's expulsion was still recent, things had been better or worse now. They could not remember. There was nothing which they could compare their present lives. They had nothing to go on except Squealer's list of figures, which invariably demonstrated that everything was getting better and better. The animals found the problem insurmountable in any case. They had little time for speculating on such things now. Only old Benjamin professed to remember every detail of his long life, and to know that things had never been, or nor ever could have been much better or worse, hunger, hardships, or disappointment being, so he said, the unnatural law of life. And yet animals never gave up hope. More, they never lost, even for an instant, their sense of humor and privilege in being members of Animal Farm. They were still only farm in the whole country and in England owned and operated by animals. Not one of them, not even the youngest, not even the newcomers whom had been brought from the farm 10 or 20 miles away, ever ceased to marvel at that. And when they heard the gun booming and saw the green flag fluttering in the masthead, their hearts swelled with immeasurable pride, and they turned towards the old heroic days, the expulsion of Jones, the writing of the Seven Commandments, and the great battles in which humans invaded had been defeated. None of the old dreams had been abandoned. The republic of the animals which Major had foretold, when the green fields of England had been untrodden by human feet, were still believed in. Some day was coming. It might not be soon. It might not be in the lifetime of any animal living now, but still it was coming. Even the tune of the Beast of England was perhaps hummed secretly here and there. At any rate, it was the fact that every animal on the farm knew it. There was no one that could have dared to sing it aloud. It might have been their lives were hard, and not all of their hopes had been filled, but they were still conscious that they were not as other animals. If they were hungry, it was from not feeling tyrannical. It was not from feeding tyrannical human beings. It was, if they worked hard, at least they worked for themselves. No creature among them went upon two legs. No creature called any other creature master. All animals were equal. One day in early summer, Squealer ordered the sheep to follow him. They led them onto a piece of waste ground at the other end of the farm that had become overgrown with birch saplings. The sheep spent the whole day there browsing under the leaves under Squealer's supervision. In the evening, he returned to the farmhouse himself, but as it was, warm weather told the sheep to stay where they were. It ended by their remaining there for the whole week. During the time, the other animals saw nothing of them. Squealer was with them for a great part of every day. He was, he said, teaching them to sing a new song for which privacy was needed. It was just as the sheep returned on the pleasant evening, when the animals had finished work and were making their way to the farm building, that the terrified neighing of horses sounded from the yard. Startled, the animals stopped in their tracks. It was Clover's voice. She neighed again, and all the animals broke into a gallop and rushed in the yard. Then they saw what Clover had seen. It was a pig walking on his hind legs. Yes, it was Squealer. He walked awkwardly, as though not quite used to supporting his considerable bulk in that portion. But with perfect balance, he was strolling across the yard. And a moment later, out from the door of the farmhouse came a long file of pigs, all walking on their hind legs. Some did it better than others. One or two were even a trifle unsteady and took as though they would have liked to support it with a stick, but every one of them made his way around the yard successfully. And finally, there was a tremendous baying of dogs and a shrill cowering from the black cockerel, and out came Napoleon himself, majestically upright, casting hauntfully glances from side to side with his dogs gambolling around him. He carried a whip in his trotter. There was a dead silence, amazed and terrified, huddling together. The animals watched a long line of pigs march slowly around the yard. It was as though the world had turned upside down. There came a moment when the first shock had worn off on them, in spite of everything, in spite of the terror of the dogs, and in the habit, developing long years, of never complaining, never criticizing, no matter what had happened, they might have uttered some word of protest. But just in that moment, as though at a signal, all the sheep burst into a tremendous bleating of 4 legs good, 2 legs better. 4 legs good, 2 legs better. 4 legs good, 2 legs better. It went on for 5 minutes without stopping, and by the time the sheep had quieted down, the chance to utter any protest had been past, for the pigs had marched back in the farmhouse. Benjamin felt a nose nuzzling at his shoulder. He looked around. It was Clover. Her old eyes looked dimmer than ever. Without saying anything, he tugged gently at his mane and led him round to the end of the big barn, where the 7 commandments were written. For a minute or two, they stood gazing at the tattered wall with its white lettering. "My sight is fading," she said finally. "Even when I was young, I could have read what was written there. I could not have read what was written there. It appears to me that the wall looks different, and the 7 commandments the same what they used to be, Benjamin." For once, Benjamin constituted to break his rule and read out to her what was written on the wall. There was nothing except a single commandment. It read, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." After that, it did not seem strange when next day the pigs who were supervising the work on the farm all carried whips in their trotters. It did not seem strange to learn that the pigs had brought themselves a wireless set, were arranging to install a telephone, and had set out subscriptions to John Bull Tidbits and the Daily Mirror. It did not seem strange when Napoleon was seen strutting in the farmhouse garden with a pipe in his mouth. No, not even when the pigs took Mr. Jones's clothes out of the wardrobe and put them on. Napoleon himself appearing in his black coat, rat-catcher breeches, and leather leggings, where his favorite so appeared in a watered silk dress which Mrs. Jonesman used to wear on Sundays. A week later, in the afternoon, a number of dog carts drove up to the farm. A deputation of neighboring farmers had been invited to take a tour of the inspection. They were shown all over the farm and expressed great admiration for everything they saw, especially the windmill. The animals were weeding the turnip field. They worked diligently, hard, raising their faces from the ground and not knowing whether to be more frightened of the pigs or the human visitors. That evening, loud laughter and bursts of singing came from the farmhouse, and suddenly, at the sound of a mingling voice, the animals were stricken with curiosity. What could be happening in there? Now that for the first time animals and human beings were meeting on terms of equality. With one accord, they began to creep as quietly as possible to the farmhouse garden. At the garden, paused, half frightened to go on, but Clover led the way in. They tiptoed up the house, and such animals as were tall enough peered in the dining room window. There, round in the long table, sat half a dozen farmers and half a dozen enameled pigs. Napoleon himself occupying the seat of honor at the head of the table. The pigs appeared completely at ease in their chairs. The company had been enjoying a game of cards and had broken off from the moment, evidently in order to drink a toast. A large jug was circulating, and the mugs had been refilled with beer. No one noticed the wonderful faces of the animals that gazed in the window. Mr. Plinkington of Foxwood had stood up, his mug in his hand. In a moment he said he would ask the present company to drink a toast. But before doing so, a few words that he felt it incumbent upon him to say. It was a source of great satisfaction to him, he said. He was sure, to all the other present, to feel that the long period of mistrust and misunderstanding had now come to an end. And there had been a time, not that he or any other of the present company had shared such sentiments, but there had been a time when the respected proprietors of Animal Farm had been regarded, he would not say with honesty, but perhaps with a certain measure of misgivings by their human neighbors. Unfortunately, incidents had occurred, mistaken ideas had been current. If it had been felt that the existence of a farm owned and operated by pigs was somehow abnormal and was liable to have an unsettling effect in the neighborhood. Too many farmers had assumed, without due inquiry, that on such a farm a spirit of license and indiscipline would prevail. They had been nervous about the effect upon their own animals, or even their animal employees. But all such doubts were now dispelled. Today, he and his friends had visited Animal Farm and inspected every inch of it with their own eyes, and what they find, not only the most up-to-date methods, but a discipline and an orderliness which should be the example to all farms everywhere. He believed that he had a right in saying that the lower animals on the farm did more work and received less food than any animals in the county. Indeed, he and his fellow visitors today had observed many features which were intended to introduce on their own farms immediately. He would end his remark by emphasizing once again the friendly feeling that subsided and ought to be subject between Animal Farm and its neighbors. Between pigs and human beings there was not, and there was not need to be, any clash of interest whatsoever. The interest and their difficulties were one. Was not the labor problem the same everywhere? Here it became apparent that Mr. Plinkington was about to spring some more careful prepared witticism on the company, but for the moment he was too overcome by amusement to be able to utter it. After much choking, during which which chines turned purple, he managed to get out. "If you had your lower animals to contend with," he said, "we'd have our lower classes." This bon mot set the table in a roar. Mr. Plinkington once again congratulated the pigs on lower rations and the long working hours and the general absence of pampering which he had observed on Animal Farm. And now, he said finally, he would ask the company to raise their feet and make certain that their glasses were full. "Gentlemen," concluded Mr. Plinkington, "gentlemen, I give a toast for the prosperity of Animal Farm." There was enthusiastic cheering and the stamping of feet. Napoleon was so gratified that he left his place and came around the table to clink his mug against Mr. Plinkington's before emptying it. When the cheering had died down, Napoleon, who had remained on his feet, intimated that he too felt he had a few words to say. Like all of Napoleon's speeches, it was short and to the point. He too, he said, was happy that the period of misunderstanding was at an end. And for a long time there had been rumors circulating. He had reason to think, by some malgratory enemy, that there was something subservient and even revolutionary in the outlook of himself and his colleagues. They had been credited with attempting to stir up rebellion among the animals on the neighboring farms. Nothing could be further from the truth. Their sole wish now and in the past was to live at peace and in normal business relations with their neighbors. This farm, which he had the honor to control, he added, and cooperate enterprise. The title deeds, which were his own possessions, were owned by the pigs jointly. He did not believe, he said, that any of the old suspicions still lingered. But certain changes had been made since in the routine of the farm, which should be the effect of promoting confidence still further. Here, though, the animals on the farm had a rather foolish custom of addressing one another as comrade. This was to be suppressive. There was also a very strange custom, whose origin was unknown, of marching every Sunday morning past a boar's skull, which was nailed to the post of the garden. This, too, would be suppressed, and the skull had already been buried. His visitors might have observed, too, the green flag which flew from the masthead. If so, they would perhaps have noted that the white hoof and horn, which had previously been marked, had now been removed. It would be a plain green flag from now onwards. He had only one criticism, he said, to make of Mr. Plinkington's excellent neighborly speech. Mr. Plinkington had referred throughout to Animal Farm. He could not, of course, know, for he, Napoleon, was only now the first time announcing that the name Animal Farm had been abolished. Henceforth, the farm had been known as the Manor Farm, which he believed was the correct and original name. "Gentlemen," concluded Napoleon, "I will give you the same toast as before, but in a different form. Fill your glasses to the brim, gentlemen. Here is my toast, to the prosperity of the Manor Farm." There was the same hearty cheering as before, and the mugs were emptied to the dredge. But the animals outside gazed at the scene. It seemed to them that some strange thing was happening. What was it had altered their faces of the pigs. Clover's olden eyes flitted from one face to another. Some of them had 5 chins, some had 4, some had 3. But what was it that seemed to be melting and changing? Then the applause had come to an end. The company took up their cards and continued the game that had been interrupted, and the animals crept silently away. But they had gone 20 yards when they stopped short. An uproar of voices was coming from the farmhouse. They rushed back and looked through the window again. Yes, a violent quarrel was in the process. There was shouting, banging on the table, sharp, suspicious glances, furious denials. The sources of the trouble appeared to be Napoleon and Mr. Plinkington had played an ace of spades simultaneously. 12 voices were shouting in anger, and they were all alike. No question. What had happened to the faces of the pigs? The creatures outside the creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. And already it was impossible to say which was which. Thus concludes the story of Animal Farm. Once again, in a Google Doc, make sure again your answers are in complete sentences. Number 1, what is significant about the following lines? Squealer was so fat that he could have difficulty seeing out of his eyes. Number 2, what is significant about the line, it was a pig walking on his hind legs? And number 3, what was significant of Napoleon carrying a whip in his trotter? Join me next time. We'll be delving into the project portion and the accompanying version project portion of Animal Farm. This is Mr. Campbell saying, keep reading, 8th grade.